Women have the power.
It's about me through.
Welcome to the stage, author and former vice chair of GE, Beth Comstock.
Get to rock the boat and make a mess, so I said quietly, agreed politely.
Hello. How are you all today? Great to be here. I love the energy in the room. Thank you for having me as part of it. So look, I'm here. I had an amazing career. I rose to great heights as vice chair of one of the biggest companies on earth. I was part of a team that helped define a clean tech future, a digital future. We generated billions of dollars of revenue and brand value. I could tell you how smart we were, how clever the teams I got to work with. Maybe we were lucky too. I could tell you that story, and maybe some of it would be true. But I kind of think you deserve a different story. So I'm gonna tell you that because I want to spark something different today. I'm going to share my story. I've curated 5 episodes of my story for you and some lessons. And it's not a particularly scary story. That is, unless you're afraid of messiness, because it's very messy. It's about change, and change is messy. And I didn't even start my first slide, so you missed this whole sparking action. But what I want to do is give you the Sparks Note version of what I'm here to talk about today, which is this. Change happens when you give yourself permission to imagine a better future, and then the key part, you have to make it happen. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. So here we go, episode 1. I call this episode Sweaty Ears, Cold Door. I was 26 years old. There I was, my sweaty ear pressed against a cold door. I can't be this. I thought it. I think I probably said it out loud. I can't be this. On the other side of the door was my then husband telling my mother that we were getting a divorce. I was married to my college sweetheart. We had an amazingly beautiful daughter. I had just landed a big media job as publicity coordinator at NBC. By all accounts, I was on my way. But you know what? I was filled with despair. The story that I had signed up for, small town, good girl, was not really the story of my life as I saw it going forward. I saw a big gap in the story I was expected to live and the story I had imagined that I wanted to live, and I had to change that. Okay, episode 2. I call this one wallpaper and wet hands. Okay, now I'm 31 years old. I'm pregnant with my second daughter, remarried, and I'm standing at the UN, and I remember it because I had the most hideous maternity dress. It was floral, and it blended with the wallpaper, and all you could see was my head. I was the communications person at CNN and Turner, and I was accompanying Ted Turner, the swashbuckling media titan of the day. I had worked there for a year. The problem was he didn't know my name. And in that moment, I said, I got to change something. I am invisible. So I did what anyone would do in that moment. My boss goes into the men's room, and I stand outside the door and wait for him. He comes out, and I say, "Hi, Ted, He grabs my hand, shakes it, looks at me like, "What are you doing?" His hands were really wet, so that was good. And he kept looking at me like, "What do you got to say?" And I lost my nerve. I looked down at my shoes, and he walked away, zipping his fly, by the way. But at that moment, I was incredibly proud of myself. I had given myself permission. I stood up and I did something as a shy, awkward, also introverted person. I got up my courage, and it's important to me. Okay, episode 3. This is a mystery. This is called The Case of the Missing Confidence. So at this stage, I'm 43. I'm a newly minted chief marketing officer. Now look at her. Doesn't she look incredibly confident? Like she knows what she's doing, right? Wrong. About 6 months after I got tapped to the job, my then boss, Jeff Immelt, who was CEO of GE, called me into his office and he said, "Hey, you got to be more confident. What's up with you? I put you in this job for a reason. I never hear from you. I don't just want your voice, I want your opinions. My reaction was, oh my gosh, he's figured me out. I actually thought I was doing my best Meryl Streep. I was acting really confident. But he was saying, you gotta speak up and put it out there. And you see, I was feeling really exposed. I didn't come to this job with traditional marketing experience. We hadn't had a marketing leader in my company for 20 years. I had had experience in communications and advertising at NBC, but this was different. Ad Age called me the unlikely marketing leader with no marketing experience. I had never taken an MBA. I didn't have my MBA. I don't even think I'd taken a business class. But I was there for a reason, and I had to reinvent marketing, and I had to figure it out while I was doing it. I had a lot to discover. Okay, episode 4. This is called Moshing is for Punk Rockers, Not for Innovators. And I didn't take a picture at the time, but imagine that's me, although I'd probably be wearing a top, but imagine that's me. This is the time I jumped out of the balcony and into the mosh pit. Well, metaphorically, because I'm afraid of heights, so you would have never caught me jumping out of the balcony. But it's about a time I lost perspective. I was at GE, had done well. We launched our clean tech effort, Eco-Imagination. They're like, hey, you're good at change. Go back to NBC. Digital's coming. Help us figure it out. And I went back and proceeded to not do a very good job. I created some momentum. We acquired a women's property. We launched Hulu. The women's property failed, but that wasn't enough to get me fired. What almost got me fired in that job is we became warring tribes. It was the digital cool kids against the you just don't get it, do you, you broadcast Luddites. We're leading the future. But I got down in the weeds. We duked it out. We became warring tribes, and I lost my way, and we lost our way. So it was the time I came closest to being fired because I couldn't survey the landscape. I got in, and sort of duked it out with the best of them, but I lost perspective. Okay, so some episodes to give you a sense. So what have we learned so far? I know I've learned a lot. Hopefully you'll learn a little bit more as I go forward, but I want to share some learnings as I've reflected on a career of messiness. First of all, change is hard and personal. That door I showed is there for every one of us. It's that door that stands between where you are and where you want to go. Look, when I got divorced at an early age, it was a huge risk, especially to my family. I had no choice but to make it work. It was challenging, but I had to master my own story. And I'd argue so do you. Do you know what your story is? Because you have to be the master of it. It means you have to face your fears. You have to overcome things you don't know. Go forward without knowing all the answers. But in that moment of change, what choice do you have but to try to make it work the best you can? And I've used that divorce story because it served me for my life and my career to say, you know how to get through this tough change. You know how to be a change maker. Whenever I've been in tough times, to go back and say, you've been here before. To say to myself, I can be this. I can do this. I also rediscovered the power of story. I'm a storyteller. Many of you are storytellers. Think about the power of story to define the future. It's what reinvigorates businesses, launches products, open new markets. It's the glue that binds us. It tells the world where you've been and where you're going. What's your story? Well, I found this recently. This was from my autobiography when I was 14. Trust me, this was the most interesting thing you'd find in my biography, unless you wanted to know why Nick Thomas wasn't kissing me at the movie. But my story has always included ambition. But I lost that, and I was afraid to tell it. At 14, I was ambitious. I've always been that person. Knowing your story is knowing who you are and owning it. I've also been incredibly curious. I say I wanted to be 50 different things. I still do. Curiosity is part of my story. My story then, small town girl, wants to see the world. My story today, I'm still a discoverer and explorer. part of owning your story is also giving yourself permission to have one and to make it happen. It's for big steps and small steps. Now look, I'm not telling you you need to get a divorce, and I don't recommend it to be able to navigate change. That Ted Turner story was equally important to, well, not equally, was also important to me because it was a small step forward. But what you have to do is give yourself permission. And so I want you to think about writing yourself a permission slip. You may remember this from high school. Many of us may have written notes from our mother saying that we can get out of chemistry or phys ed. I, of course, didn't do that. I was too much a goody two-shoes, but I've made up for it since then. But I really like this notion of writing yourself a permission slip, especially for the small things. I, Beth Comstock, give myself permission to ask a question in the next meeting, to go meet somebody new here, to stand up here as a shy person and speak to 1,000 people. And I find it's a really helpful, if a little silly, mental hack. Just take out your notepad, write yourself a permission slip. And I bet what's behind it is you're still waiting for someone to tell you it's okay. So I want to ask you, who are you waiting for? Who are you waiting to tell you it's okay? Are you waiting for your boss? Your mom? Mother May I? Did you play that when you were little? Maybe you're waiting for Yoda, Star Trek fans. The reality is you're waiting often for yourself. And I saw this time and again in my colleagues when I worked. The reality that people would often come in with great ideas, but then they'd say, I can't do that. I don't have enough budget. My boss won't let me. Oh, the investors will never go for it. I don't have the right team. And maybe those were true, but often they were alibis. You peel back the reality, and inside is fear at taking a risk, at taking a small step forward. And partly it's because we have gatekeepers. One, we're gatekeepers of our own mind. We tell ourselves we can never do that. And the reality of the world is there are gatekeepers in any part of life. What's a gatekeeper? A gatekeeper is that person who stands in front of the gate and says, you can't get through here. They don't like new ideas. Often they want to hang on to what little power they have. And I came to realize that there are always going to be gatekeepers. And that's where the permission granting comes in. You have to figure out a way to get around them. I ended up working at CNN and with Ted Turner because I left NBC early because I worked for a really bad boss, and he was a classic gatekeeper. But as soon as I got to CNN and then other companies, I realized that there are always gatekeepers. And my job was to figure out a way around them. In fact, I had to do a mindset shift that every time I heard no, I had to say, I think I hear an invitation. To me, no is not yet. This ability to keep going after an idea, to hone it, it's a test of your resiliency. Eventually, I did go back to NBC. I led communications and licensing and some things, and we had this amazing idea for a retail experience. We called it the NBC Experience Store. I pitched it to the head of the company, and he said no. Our team was so devastated because we were convinced this had to live in the world. We went back, and by the third time, Bob looked at me, and he said, I have tried so hard to say no, but you make it so darn hard. The answer is yes. But I realized he was testing us. Did we make the idea better? Yep. But he was testing our confidence in the idea, and especially our ability to keep coming back and fighting for what we believed in. Fighting for confidence. So that case of missing confidence, well, I eventually found it, or at least some of it. And surprisingly, it was inside, but it was also outside. One of the things I had to realize in my career is that I was different from a lot of the people I worked with, especially when I worked for a big multinational industrial like GE. I was largely a woman. I was a woman in a largely... I have to think about that one, right? How does that work? I was a woman in a largely male-dominated organization. I was a marketer in a company of financial and mechanical engineers, and I came from media into an industrial company. And so I had to figure out that difference was my calling card. By owning my story, I had to own the fact that I had a different perspective. And it also helped me bring a different perspective to what's marketing. it became a rallying cry to take the job seriously. Marketing, it's about living in the market. And when you live in the market, you start to see patterns and trends, and you see where the world is going. You have a much different understanding of the future and how to think about where things are emerging. So I had to become the outsider inside. That became my calling and part of my story. So when you're living in the market, you have to be willing to get out and get uncomfortable, to see things that are unusual, even weird. It's how you get an edge on the future. Look, weird isn't welcomed in most workplaces, but weird has been a differentiator for me. It's taken me from crazy places like judging boy band competitions in South Korea to understand consumer trends, hanging out with F-15 fighters in Israel to understand the startup ethos, and to be one of the first women in my company who went to Saudi Arabia at a time that women weren't going to Saudi Arabia. And there we understood by going to see for ourselves that women were dying of stage 4 breast cancer. And we could potentially help, and we did help, by creating mobile screening units because the women couldn't drive and get help. So I made it my practice to be open to meeting just people who were different. Poets, fringe scientists, theologians, musicians, people who could start to expose me and my teams to different perspectives. Over time, I unleashed my curiosity, and it built more of my confidence. It became a bit of camouflage in those times when I had to be afraid that I didn't know what I was doing or where I was going. It allowed me to become a bit of an instigator of change because you see the trends, you see the future. It's not your idea. It's these things unfolding, and you want to fight for them. So I told you Jeff Immelt gave me some tough feedback. That was really something I didn't want to hear, but I needed to hear it. And I was now accountable to him to make change. So I had to come back, and I had to use my difference and my expertise, and instead of going into meetings and talking about gap accounting or whatever they wanted to talk about, I brought in the outside, brought in my perspectives, tried to bring the outside in, and to try to kind of lead that way. Feedback's a critical element of change. Ask yourself, how often do you ask that question? Tell me something I don't want to hear. Once I got some feedback I didn't want to hear from colleagues who said, you know, you have a go-it-alone style. You don't ask for help. You expect everything to be perfect. We don't like working with you. I didn't want to hear that feedback, but I had to. And I had to look at them, and I had to say, I've listened, I accept it, and I need your help. Now, not every piece of feedback you're going to feel that way about, but it's especially those ones that are standing in your way. Tell me something I don't want to hear. And in times of change, the faster you get feedback, the better able you are to react and adapt and move forward. That mosh pit story, hold on, it was about conflict. And sometimes, you know, the bark is worse than the bite. Sometimes the bite's not even that bad if it's a yappy little dog, right? And sometimes, let's face it, they are just yappy dogs who are getting in our way. But really, the conflict I experienced in that last time at NBC was because people were afraid. Digital disruption was happening. YouTube was just on the scene. People were like, oh my gosh, cats playing the piano? We don't know how to do that. They were afraid. I didn't recognize that. They also were kind of afraid of me, my fervor to make change, my insistence that it had to be done this way. I also didn't like conflict, so I avoided it. What could I have done? It would have been much better to bring teams together, share funding, share budget, share joint accountability. I know by not doing that, we killed the women's property we acquired. Luckily, we were able to get something together and launch a product like Hulu, but we could have been much better. And so it was a painful experience, but I came to appreciate the value of inviting in your critic, of co-opting the resistors. It's about being able to fail. Look, this is the F word of business. I bet if I meet you later and ask you if you like to fail, you're going to say no. None of us like to fail. People who go around saying, yeah, I fail fast, I fail small, like I did 5 sit-ups this morning. Most of us don't like to fail. But as a change maker, as somebody who's on the leading edge of change, You have to accept that failure is part of the job. Look, you don't have to like it. It's okay to grieve your loss. It's okay to say, this stinks, to wallow in it. But then you have to pick yourself up and say, what did I learn? To me, kind of one of the big things I've learned is that a great career, a competitive company is about how fast you learn. Speed to learning is one of the most advantageous things you can do for yourself and your company. It's not about how big did you fail, it's how fast did you learn. And so with that comes a lot of testing, a lot of figure it out, going forward with a hypothesis that just says, here's what might be, not that I'm certain, and testing it, and then with confidence figuring out how you scale the idea from there. I believe this just so deeply, and I think it's really important in business and in life. Look, if failure's not an option, then how can we ever get to success? And so that leads me to the last chapter, the last episode of my story. I call this Begin Again. It's live streaming right now. It's me, age 58, here, right now. I, in many ways, and basically every way, am starting over. I left my big company platform, big job at a big company over a year ago, or rather, I should maybe say, my job left me in a management turmoil and new leadership team. And I had to jump into the unknown in a way I'd done before, but was nonetheless incredibly scary. I had to remind myself of much of what I've shared with you here, that it's a lot about knowing your story. I'm a discoverer. I'm out discovering again. I'm wandering around. I've had to test and learn. I launched a book. It's not all worked exactly the way I wanted it to. Hopefully you'll get a chance to read it. I'm really appreciative that the ad club is giving you a copy. But it's as much about failure, and I had to remind myself that in the past year. I mean, for crying out loud, I did 5 different websites to launch my book because I didn't like any of them. And it's big steps and small steps, but I stand here before you as somebody who's excited about beginning again. Because one of the things I've learned, and hopefully one of the things I can impart on you, is just this lesson. You don't just live a life. You blunder your way toward creating one you love. And I'm off to do that now. I'm a discoverer. I'll be out discovering. I hope to see you soon. And remember, change happens when you imagine a better future, and then you take steps to make it happen. Thank you for having me, and I hope you have a good day.